Good morning, class. Please sit down. Take a seat. Good. So, this year we're going to study Victorianism. Yes. It happens to be my favorite subject in the program. So, I hope that you are as excited as I am to work on the subject. Yes? Good. Sit down, I said. Sit down. Good. Well, in today's class, I have brought some documents. We're going to talk about the children's labor in the early 19th century. Well, in between 1833 and 1880. Good. So, take your sheets of papers, take your pens, and please write down, take notes. I think that now you are old enough to be able to take your notes on your own, right? Yes, exactly. So, the children's labour. What is to know, first of all, which is probably obvious to all of you, is that children of the upper classes and the middle classes didn't work. Good. That's the first point. Then what you have to know is that in the Victorian age there was the Industrial Revolution. Yes. So for those who don't know what was the Industrial Revolution, it was the mechanization of the means of work. What do I mean? Before, the workers were peasants, so there were farmers, they worked with the cows, the pigs, they grew crops, things like this. But then, with the empire growing for Britain, with India, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Scotland, Canada, and Ireland, there were more and more trades. Well, with the trades, more and more companies grew in creation of cotton, for example, of mining products. Mines opened for the coal, because now people heated themselves no longer with wood cut into the woods, but on the contrary, with coal. So it developed a lot, but also it developed a lot of misery that was all put together in London. So there was a lot of people who could not afford to give an education to their children like you have nowadays. And so many children had to work. They didn't have any choice because otherwise they couldn't feed themselves. At the time, a lot of families did children in order to have a helping hand to get money and to feed themselves. I know it's very sad, but that's how it was at the time. So, when I talk of Victorianism, do you have any famous name that comes to you? Queen Victoria, yes, very good. What do you know about the Queen Victoria? Exactly, she's just been passed through by Elizabeth II, but her reign was the longest of history. It was from 1838 to 1901. It was very long. But Elizabeth II has just taken a longer time of reign. I don't recall how many years, but a lot too. So Queen Victoria became queen when she was 18 and became the Empress of India. been a lot of misery, but however, a lot of acts that had been passed in order to make life easier for the children. But people intend to forget that, even though, of course, there was so much misery that it took a century almost to really improve the conditions of living of the people. Now, who else do you think of? Charles Dickens. I was waiting for that one. Personally, it's one of my favourite authors. He wrote Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, A Great Expectation. He wrote a lot of books. There are so many, but these three are the most known, I believe. So Oliver Twist is a beautiful story, and it denounces many things that I'm going to talk about to you. But first of all, what you have to know about Charles Dickens is that he's a self-made man. He had an education at first, but then his father went to jail, and they had no more money. And at the time, when a man went to prison, his family had to come with him if they couldn't afford living. So he went to prison with his father. He was very poor, and, well, he started writing, and he became known. He started writing for newspapers. His stories were published in newspapers, actually. So yeah, and he defended the most miserable people, prostitutes. He defended them, and he defended, of course, children in Great Expectation, in Oliver Twist, and in David Copperfield. There are cases of so many miserable children, and also the conditions of living and of harsh work. All the money that he made, or a big part anyway, was given into houses he had created for prostitutes and their children to live in. And for the time it was very courageous, because prostitutes were considered as like monsters, even though they had no choice to live, of course. So he defended many people, and I think it's a very great man. I admire him a lot. So the children lived terribly. They were hired because they were very small, with small hands, and so they helped going into the mines because they were very thin and they can go through. However, there were a lot of accidents. For example, when it rained a lot, sometimes everything, the walls of mud, because it's mud underneath the earth, obviously, were held with wooden sticks, but it wasn't really well built. They did with what they had, so sometimes it just collapsed and they all died because of the mud, or sometimes it was flooded when it rained too much. So there were many accidents. Also in the cotton factories, they were hired to go underneath the machines to carry the cottons that were going downwards, were falling from the creations. So it was very harsh. Can you imagine yourself going into a mine? No, right. It's very harsh. So do I think. So I have some notes there, and I'm going to talk to you about some acts that had been put into practice. So there was, of course, as you may know, a lot of prosperity into the country, but it was given to the Queen, and everything looks like the poor people. I'm just looking for my notes. Reforms. here are the reforms. So, the first and the major reform was the 1831 Cotton Mill Act, which stipulated that 12 hours work under 18 was no more authorized. They had to work less than 12 hours per day, of course. 12 hours per day. You can imagine how long the days were for those poor people. And until 21, no one was allowed to work during the night. In 1833, there was the Factory Act, which was put, and it stipulated that no children in factories under 9 could work. So there were no children under 9 working there. And it came from a royal commission because there had been a lot of investigations. And there is something quite absurd that has been found in these royal commissions. It's that the work of dogs into the mines was forbidden before the work of children. Yes, it's crazy, but that's how it is. Also, there were a lot of children who died because of the machines who cut their hands and it infected. A lot of children who died, as I said before, into the mines. And they lived in misery. And it's not that the parents didn't like their children, of course. It's that they had no choice to be able to feed themselves. And what you have to know is that after this act, because it didn't really settle the problem, the government went around the problem. They didn't really resolve it, because what they didn't seem to understand was that it was the society and how harsh it is, how people needed to live, that made parents need their children to work. So parents went to factories to pretend that their child were 9, because at the time, as you may know, there was no records of or birth certificates as today. So you can't pretend you're any age. So parents waited for their child to look approximately 9, because a child, it's very hard to guess what age they are. It depends on the height, etc. So if you were lucky to have a tall child, you could just send him over to the mine or to a factory and pretend that he was 9. And so he was taken. So it was the parents who had no choice. It's very harsh. It's a very harsh system. It's very hard for everybody. And also it was very hard for the people, like for the MPs. So the members of parliament. If you don't remember what we said in the lesson of last week, MPs are the members of parliament. Good. The MPs were landowners, and most of them, before, they had farms with peasants on it, etc. But with the revolution, the industrial revolution, they became owners of factories and mines. So it was tricky for important people of the upper classes to denounce facts, because it was the lords, the important people, who were owning those factories, those great factories, who were taking children to work. So it explains a lot of problems of the society. It is why nothing was changed. Well, there had been a lot of acts, but it was only targeting a small population, so it wasn't very easy for them. So there were many acts. Then there was the 1844 Factory Act, which was called the First Health and Safety Act. Write this down, of course, it's very important. Good. So factories had machines, as I've had told you, and it created a lot of danger. The first act it was the first act that obliged the employer to protect the machines when they were in motions. So it was crazy before they weren't protected, so you could cut yourself at any time. So this is crazy. So dangerous machines had to be fenced off. If not, it was a criminal offense. And as I've told you, many children worked near machines. It was the smaller people who were near the machines because of their fingers, their hands. They could go under the machines, and it was very dangerous during the machine because it was during the machines were at work. So it limited also the hours of work of the children to 6.5, with 3 hours a day of education. But employers did give 6 hours a day of work, but didn't give 3 hours a day of education. Instead, they let the Sunday, and they used the Sunday to work. So you can imagine there was... And at the time, the government couldn't check if everything was alright, because as I've told you, we don't have the age of the children, and the children would lie if they were asked to, because they knew, even if they were very young, that they had to work. Then in the cities, as we can see with Oliver Twist, there weren't just the factories, there were the children who were taught to be thieves, to take money from the gentry in their pockets, to do things like that. Indeed, you probably know that in the Victorianism period, there was a lot of criminality in the city of London, and it's because there was so much misery, and as you might know also, London was a very terrible place to live in, and actually it's also then that a lot of people of the gentry decided really to buy some mansions in the countryside in order to be able to be in a pure air and far away from all these polluted places where it was so miserable. It was really dirty. There was all these poor people. We could see the chimney sweepers who were once more kids because they were very small and they could go up the chimneys. So yeah, and it's why I think people like Charles Dickens are very important, because through his work, through his courage, through his work and his writings, he's defended so many people, and he probably helped changing things. And Queen Victoria definitely read his works, maybe not all of his book, but at least 2 or 3. And that's what's good about it. He denounced the fact that the children were treated like animals, worse than animals, because as I've told you, dogs were forbidden to go down the mines before the children, so you can imagine how harsh it was. And Charles Dickens was one of the rare persons who considered that children were to be protected and not just sent to work and to gain money. And he thought that it was really important. So I think that you must really understand how hard it was, and it's also going to announce the lesson of next week, which will be about communism and how it came in the working classes. So you might guess, because they're just children who were born in about 1830, 1840, were adults in the 1890, when all the ideas of Karl Marx were coming and becoming popular, and when all the uprisings were going to start about well, revolutions and equality. It's because the Industrial Revolution made things way too harsh for people. So, thank you, class, and I hope that you've enjoyed this lesson. Good. So, see you next week. Bye, class.